Thanks.
So I'll start out by saying this is a rather informal way to talk about theology under any circumstances. But I do want to preface my remarks by saying that talking about the relationship between theology and reparation leaves me two options, and I'm going to take one of the two options. On one hand, we could talk about theology and reparation from the perspective of Luke 4 and Matthew 25, where we get a sense from scripture that we ought to pursue justice and righteousness in order to consider ourselves to be in right relation with God. That is absolutely true. However, I'm going to take a slightly different take, perhaps a more unorthodox route, no pun intended there, and actually start to think about what it is that tempts us to make a false distinction between what is practical and what we know in our heart of hearts to be the truth or to be ideal. So which means that, well, it means one of many things, but it also means that we will presume that everyone here is a person of goodwill and wants to see the right thing take place out of our love for humanity. What I'm going to address is the fact that we just oftentimes don't know as Americans how to get over what other people say is impractical and impossible and plow through the feeling of futility and impossibility in order to actually organize ourselves to do what is both right and possible. So what that means is that I'm going to have to forego some low-hanging fruit. Presidents number 45 and presidents number 43, I believe, are probably obvious people if we were to take a poll and say who among American modern presidents are least likely to support reparations. Nobody would probably say either of the Bushes or number 45 would push for reparations. And so it's very easy to sort of choose them as targets for the unrighteous folks who get in the way of African-American advancement. I want to choose someone to take a close look at right now who's a little bit closer to home for us. And I do that because looking at someone who we identify in one way or another helps us get a clearer look at ourselves. And it helps us to avoid this tendency towards self-deception that comes with always aiming at our most obvious enemies. Nevertheless, in recent years, the political climate in our nation has been such that even presidential candidates have had to discuss openly their opinion on reparations for Afro-Americans. But before Marianne Williamson, Elizabeth Warren, now VP Kamala Harris, and Bernie Sanders offered their responses to unfortunately vague and malformed questions about reparations on the debate stage, former President Barack Obama said reparations was a non-starter for his campaign more than a decade ago. A few months ago, however, far from political office, Barack Hussein Obama offers more candid comments about reparations in a conversation with Bruce Springsteen. About midway through their conversation, Springsteen asks the former president if he thinks the United States is prepared to deconstruct its founding myth and enact a program for reparations. Obama replies that theoretically, he says, some sort of reparations for slavery and the depredations of Jim Crow are justified. And he goes through an explanation that if not all, and if not most, but a great deal of America's wealth and power does indeed come from the slave trade. Springsteen continues to ask him, knowing all of the above, how do you as president push or prepare the nation for something you say is so justified? Obama dodges the how do you as president part and says, we're not ready. Obama returns the question back on the body politic and asks Springsteen, could you get a country to agree and own that history? And he continues to say, and my judgment as president was that as a practical matter, that was unattainable, politically a non-starter, but potentially actually counterproductive, considering that members of the struggling white working class would resent, quote, a massive program designed to deal with the past, but isn't speaking to their future, close quote. Springsteen digs in a little bit more and continues by saying, so are you telling me we live in a country where we can do that for bankers on Wall Street, but we can't do it for part of the population that has been struggling for so long? We can't do it for part of this population. He digs in because he wants Obama to actually show this contrast. We should talk about it anyway, Obama concludes, if for no other reason than to educate the country about a past that too often is not taught and that we would rather forget. In Obama's memoir, however, he's a little bit clearer regarding his political ethical logic. Obama recalls feeling pulled in two directions during his first campaign. He was pulled between what he calls certain African Americans on one hand, who were unconvinced of his viability as a candidate, but who Obama says nevertheless demanded, quote, the most uncompromising positions on everything from affirmative action to reparation, close quote. And on the other hand, Obama was feeling a tug from a different direction, from the practical wisdom regarding issues that were considered specific to Black people, noting that issues considered specific to Black people risked triggering suspicion, if not backlash, from the broader electorate. Political wisdom warned Obama that African Americans could practice the standard special interest politics of farmers, gun enthusiasts, or other ethnic groups, but only at their peril. I wanted to neither be a supplicant, he remembers, always on the periphery of power and seeking favors from liberal benefactors, nor a permanent protester, full of righteous anger as we waited for white America to expiate its guilt. No, he says, the point was to win. And winning meant, quote, transcending the old logic, close quote, and among other things, and I quote, couching the African-American struggle in terms of a broader struggle for a fair, just, and generous society, close quote. I might not be going out on the limb to suggest that the majority of us this afternoon prefer the transcendent one. This is Obama, of course, not Jesus, to those other remarkable historical figures that I mentioned earlier. I'm not a gambling man, of course, but I'll just put that out there. But I emphasize that as we consider how theology helps us grasp with the stakes of reparations, we must pull back the curtain, I believe, and turn on the house lights and stare at the man, so to speak, in his face, as Callie House did, as we discussed last week, so that we might clarify our own relationship to and the true function of historic symbolism and winsome rhetoric, just in time to ask ourselves a very important question. What does it mean to win? So you will recall that winning requires the politician who would win to become adept in the arts of US American statescraft, which means to transform the perilous particulars of justice for Afro-Americans into the transcendent universal vapor of trite, civil, religious discourse and cliche. Etymology nerds among us will certainly have noticed that when we say that we are couching one thing with another, the speaker who is doing the couching intends to connect one subject to another in such a way that the subject being couched is pressed down while the subject doing the crouching rises to the surface, so that the subject matter being couched supports the appearance of the preferred language that the speaker wishes to present to the public. In order to win, therefore, an issue loftier than the politics of mere Afro-American life has to be attached to or placed on top of African-American community needs, so that the language that emerges for public perception is the product of a kind of political magic that draws parts of its political credibility from the open veins of the Afro-American body politic. As a result, language that is tinctured with justice, greed, cowardice, and opportunism has always in American politics since before emancipation created for many a politician a safe, beneficial relation to African-American life, but a relation that temporarily, yet nevertheless permanently and actually saves the nation. Only temporarily, however, it saves the nation from what it must ultimately experience. What the nation must ultimately experience is facing, bearing, and accepting the painful transformation required to acknowledge and repair America's long-standing debt to Afro-Americans. Clever couching, evasive idealism, political magic, if you will, has been the stock and trade of our two-party system when it comes to African Americans and economic justice. Yet, our interpretation of practical wisdom is in many cases the height of self-deception. So Presbyterians among us and others in the Reformed tradition will hear this term self-deception, I think, and immediately think of John Calvin. And that is precisely where I want your mind to go. John Calvin says two things. Human beings are prone to the self-deception to the extent that human beings mistake something that is relatively good about ourselves for a trait that actually turns us into holy, great, and wonderful people. I considered for a moment that I would save you from some of John Calvin's rhetoric and like language of color, but it's actually apt. So what John Calvin actually says is that human beings are so tempted in the blackness of our sin to imagine that a little bit of whitishness or even downright brownness in relation to ourselves actually constitute a human character that is completely white. This is what Calvin refers to as self-deception. And despite this unfortunate language with skin color, the point here is not to simply call foul on Calvin's racial sensibilities, anachronistically or not. But what Calvin wants to say is that human beings think that we are so much better than we are just because we catch a glimpse of something that we do slightly well. So I bring this up, of course, so that we can compare our concept of practical wisdom to the reality that our practical wisdom actually prevents us from doing what is both possible and necessary in terms of economic justice for Afro-Americans. Calvin goes on to say that the solution to this problem, of course, is not to compare ourselves to the worst human being or to compare ourselves to another idea of ourselves. But instead, Calvin suggests that we ought to compare ourselves to God, because in comparison to God, all of our righteousness merely pales into comparison, and we see ourselves the way that we truly are. Now, fast forward, of course, to Calvin's sermon from 1555 based on Deuteronomy 15, and we hear Calvin, he falls really into his own trap, even though in this case, he falls to take his medicine that he subscribes to other people. Calvin here is talking about slavery, and Calvin actually says that European Christian-based slavery is better than the slavery that Jews practiced and much better than the slavery of pagan nations. And Calvin goes so far as to say that the new slavery, which was new in his day, is, quote, quite tolerable and even to be judged worthy of praise, close quote. So we see here, in an effort to compare one form of slavery to another, Calvin, who I believe was seldom easily fooled, falls into this trap of self-deception by trying to look at what he wants to call a relative good, and actually calls it praiseworthy, when in reality, slavery is slavery is slavery. Calvin's own bout of self-deception is corrected, thankfully, much later by Kobna Otoba Kugoano, who was a brilliant self-emancipated convert to Christianity. Kugoano was born free in his Fonte village of Ajumako in 1757. Then he was sold into slavery in sugarcane fields in Grenada. Then he was sold into slavery of a domestic type in London, after which he wrote the brilliant Thoughts and Sentiments on the Slave Trade. All of this took place within 17 years of him being kidnapped and then sold into slavery as a 17-year-old boy. Kugoano's words offer Christians who are proud of their pseudo-enlightened slavery system a pill to swallow more bitter than the weak medicine Calvin offered his 16th century bourgeois parishioners. Kugoano holds up a mirror to the church, stating that Christian Europe's blessing upon, excuses for, and indulgence in the business of slavery not only undermine its pretense of a superior civilization, but also reveals evidence of, in Kugoano's words, a blacker absence of faith than what is found on the surface of the African skin. He says that the Christian slaver is forced to, quote, paint things not as they really are, but as his rooted prejudices present them, close quote. The Christian involved in the business of slavery, therefore, is inspired to, quote, shut his eyes against the convictions afforded him by his own senses in an effort to indulge in the fashionable way of getting riches. Kugawano finds that while slavery certainly debases the African transformed into a Black, sundry Christian nations seduce themselves to a degree with devils as they become enthralled to this international money-getting scheme. Calvin's notion of self-deception in light of his own lapse in insight concerning the joys of Christian slavery applies to the status of mere political experience on the question of reparations as well. And Kugawano's account of the business of Christian slavery reminds us that greed inspires us to see things according to our own preferred relation to the status quo. In our situation, it is key that we see things the way they really are. The business of slavery is alive and well as long as white Americans and others hoard the benefits of ill-gotten gains while also rejecting reparations in the name of political expedience. We are self-deceived and culpable for spreading mass deception if we associate reparations with impracticability and impossibility. Yet, if we compare the false gospel of political expedience to the experience of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, we will thereby gain a standard of comparison by which we can distinguish between political expedience and faithful human community and all of its broad implications for changing what we understand is possible. When we shift our focus and identify Jesus as the unity of the ideal and the practical, without confusion, without conflict, we thereby become witnesses who are faithful to living the full range of what it means to be human and what it means to be involved in all of life. And so here I want to stop and focus just a moment on an aspect of Christian theology that sometimes we miss, but I think it's very important. I'm thinking specifically of theologian Maximus the Confessor. He was an early champion of the notion of the two wills of Christ. And stick with me here for a moment. I'm not going to get too far into the early Christianity weeds because we can get lost in those thickets. And as a theology student early in my career, I often wondered, like, why did people spend so much time arguing about the particulars of theology? One substance, two substances, one will, personas, etc. But I've realized recently that it's very important to understand what is at stake when we consider that Jesus was both God and both a human being without any conflict and without any mixture, so to speak. And so for Maximus the Confessor, in brief, he understands that we must understand that in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus displays two things. He displays his capacity to love and desire his life and to continue his life and to will the extension of his life for its own sake. That is the most basic human characteristic as far as Maximus is concerned. When Maximus says that, this also reminds me of the late great Dr. James Koon, who says that Black power is for Black people essentially the power to say yes to Black being itself and to be clear with other human beings that you will accept the reality of Black life or be prepared for a struggle. I bring James Koon into this conversation because reparation is also an affirmation of life, no matter if you are an Afro-American or an American of some other ethnicity. To say that people deserve to inherit from their own ancestors' labor while others inherit from their own ancestors' labor and Afro-American people's labor is simply to affirm a very common sense approach to social life. We all deserve to be treated by one another as if we are equal to one another. For James Koon, of course, he has to emphasize the aspect of Black life and Blackness to the degree that African-American life has been suppressed by assumptions that white folks can do as they wish to African-Americans in perpetuity without any recourse or without any assumption of ever having to pay it back. And so when I think of Jesus in Gethsemane, choosing life over death, I can't help but think of Koon, because Koon reiterates that very point for the specific context of life in America today for Black people. Maximus the Confessor, of course, is not concerned with African-American people as a 7th century theologian. However, he shows that in Jesus, you have a complete expression of what it means to be a human being. And Jesus says, I don't want to die tomorrow. I'm paraphrasing, of course. But we also see Jesus equally human, yet also divine. When Jesus understands that to be truly human, out of his human will, he also expresses that he wants his life to be given over to the purpose of the eternal life that actually transcends mere life or the threat of death. So in order for Jesus to say on the night before he is murdered, I want to live my life, but I will submit to giving up my life if in so doing, something can happen through my death. Therein lies what I think is at stake for us when we consider that Jesus is both human and divine, and that as the recapitulation of the original human being, Jesus resets a pattern that is there for us not only to observe and acknowledge, but also for us to live. And so, what do these two parts, the human wanting to live and be a human for its own sake, and the human being willing out of their humanity to transcend mere life in order to truly live within eternal life? What does that have to do with reparation? Reparation requires us to embrace a deep theology through which we are reminded that the ideal and the real and the practical and our loftiest, highest dreams are only materialized in a human life. In the podcast, of course, we understand that a politician like Barack Obama or someone else will say, yes, it is important that we point to the ideal, but at the same time, in order to win, we have to remember the tried and true, the status quo, and what is most likely to win. But as people of faith, as Christian people, as people of goodwill, we have to step back a little bit from the logic employed by politicians and ask ourselves, as the politician looks at the ideal and speaks the ideal, and nevertheless does the practical thing, is it our job to repeat and live inside the logic of the politician? Or is it instead our job as citizens and as people of faith to instead change the calculus that the politician uses to understand what in fact is possible? If we accept that our role, ethically, theologically, and as citizens, is to change the calculus of what politicians have to determine what they can do and what they cannot do, then we will see ourselves very quickly and quite often in a situation like what Jesus experienced in Gethsemane. And so what do I mean by that? The biblical narrative would have us understand that it is within Jesus's power at any given moment to strike his enemies dead, to return back to heaven and escape earth, to call down thousands of angels and avenge himself, et cetera, et cetera. What helps us understand what is at stake for Jesus is that when Jesus prays to God, he shows us two things that are by no means in conflict with one another. So again, he does not want to die. He does not, if we think of ourselves in Jesus' place, he doesn't want to lose. He doesn't want to experience stigma. He doesn't want to suffer because people think that what you're doing makes no sense. But instead, Jesus decides to stay within that tension. And he decides not to escape it by using some cheap form of power. But instead, Jesus decides to submit himself to the will of the divine so that what is possible, what is ideal, can take place through Jesus's willingness to stay in the discomfort, to stay in the pain and the turmoil and ultimately the physical death of the moment. So as people contemplating reparation, I think this is what's at stake. We've heard it from all of the US presidents, from Abraham Lincoln to Barack Obama, and even more recently, of course, from 45, and even from Joe Biden, that there is something about reparations that perhaps sounds kind of like the right thing to do, but it's just not practical. It's too difficult to calculate. There are too many judicial hurdles. There are too many legislative hurdles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The claims of difficulty are not untrue. It is, in fact, very difficult to figure out what it means to have economic justice for a group of people who were once considered the property of other people, so long that the wealth of the nation continues to be intertwined with it. We can't get far in this problem if we ignore the difficulty of it. Theologically speaking, however, we simply don't have permission to forego what is both necessary and right, simply because it is difficult. And I recall again the language of Gil Scott-Heron, who observed the fact that Whitey is on the moon, while down here on Earth, poor people are having their faces bitten by rats. This common and colloquial way of putting it is to remind us that we can do extraordinarily difficult things once we decide to do these difficult things. The theology that we have as a result of reading about Jesus in Gethsemane shows us that the practical and the ideal are not to be held at arm's length, but instead, people who have the spirit of logic, the spirit of righteousness, and the spirit of God within our bodies understand that we must bear, we must carry, and we must endure the pain necessary to think about solutions, to organize one's friends, families, neighbors, and family relations, and to imagine and engineer a program that makes economic justice a reality. Yes, it is scary. Yes, it is painful. People will talk badly about you, if not to your face, certainly behind your back. And you will also have to deal with that nagging voice inside of your own head telling you that the ideal should be out there, but that you should only hold yourself responsible for what is real. If we fall prey to that logic that tells us to only be practical and leave the ideal for rhetoric, then we will be, as John Calvin described, which is self-deceived. We will tell ourselves that we are part of what is good, when in fact we will be part of what is very evil, which is to look at the practical status quo bottom line of economic life and call it the best that we can do, when in reality, what is necessary and what is right should always, in our imaginations and in our activities, be witnessed to as what is possible. And that is all I have to say so far about the theological implications of reparation. And I know that coming up here soon after our moderator transitions us, Jim has plenty to say on the topic as well.
Jermaine, thank you so very much. Brilliant once again. Very, very exciting to engage in this conversation. And I know where the questions are going to start pouring in. We've already got some going. Jim, I look forward to your comments, and then we'll have some time for discussion.
Thank you, and Jermaine, thank you. What Jermaine has said resonates with me on a couple of levels, and I'll try to get to both of those. One is on a practical and trendline level. This recognition of what is practical today, and what is practical today, and what is the reality of tomorrow, as the arc extends. There's always a dilemma, even when you see the reality of the truth. In this case, America continually in a spiral of underperformance on economic basis, not just talking economic basis, because we aren't together, because we have this this self-inflicted wound that is going to hold us back. As I look at the trends, and we talked a little bit about this last week, if I'm maintaining white privilege, if I'm in a position to maintain white privilege, that's going to be beneficial to me and mine for the foreseeable future. But I can see that future is getting smaller. I can see that the trends are changing, much like what we probably experienced in the late 50s. We could see that things were about to boil. As we look at things today on the social front, we feel things are starting to boil, and I think it's for good reason. This wealth divide that reparation ultimately speaks to is widening. We may have talked about this last week, that in the early 1960s, it was 10%, approximately 10% of average white household wealth was over the average of the overall population. So there's a disparity in favor of white wealth of 10%. That's now 16%, and it's growing. I think that as I look back over years, it was still there, but it was not growing in the 60s and 70s and even the early 80s, as some of the civil rights improvements took effect, and income among Afro-American households was actually growing faster than income in white households, and net worth or wealth in African-American households was actually growing faster than white households. The two sets of households probably pulled even in the 80s in the Reagan era. They're clearly not even now. They're in fact inflected where since 2007, household net worth in the white community is significantly slower than it was in the 70s, 80s, 90s, but it's positive. It's positive about 1% a year, whereas African American net worth is in decline 1% a year. This points to this points to some lines eventually crossing, which I think will be painful. And I don't see this improving. I see it naturally that white wealth will accelerate more because wealth begets wealth. Wealth enables risk-taking. Risk-taking enables wealth, further wealth. So I think I think as we talked about last week, we're coming to, we can start to see on the horizon that things are not getting better. They're not, and they're going to be getting worse from a social standpoint. That affects us from obviously from a life standpoint, from an economic standpoint. I think from a geopolitical standpoint, it will affect us more and more as South Africans learned decades ago that ultimately you got to be seen as doing right. So I see us. We talked last week about perhaps it's a burning platform. I think that burning platform of underperformance, and particularly underperformance relative to the rest of the world, even in economic terms, which is kind of the are we winning, are we losing metric. I see us nearing each year closer to that point where we say we've got to do something. It's time. I relate this back to the recession, the Great Recession, when leading up to the Great Recession, and I was a banker, we could see that real estate values on houses were getting significantly over their natural value, and that it was a bubble. and bubbles burst. That said, everything we looked at in the day-to-day told us that that bubble's not going to burst right now. As a banker, we rationalized it that as long as interest rates don't rise dramatically, that bubble won't burst. And as long as the Chinese continue to invest in our currency, the interest rates will stay down and the bubble won't burst. And as long as the Chinese economy has 10 million new individuals entering its labor force, as long as the Chinese economy has 10 million, which is huge, new entrants into its labor force as its agricultural economy shrunk and its manufacturing economy grew, we knew that the Chinese government needed to support American purchases and buy it and invest in our money, and that would keep interest rates down. I think that in large part happened. What we didn't see was the China's one-child policy eventually, while we weren't watching, started to shrink its workforce, and so we didn't have that fallback. I don't know that is the I wouldn't say that is necessarily the trigger, but it's a macro impact on the American real estate market that we all knew it was coming. We knew it was coming, but it was always in the best interest to continue to make loans because we needed to make profits. So I look at where we're headed. I think that this dialogue, as it's recognized that it is that this error in this moral error that our country was founded on begins to blow back on us more and more clearly, we will see reparation as necessary and as practical. It's a matter of how much pain do we get to before we recognize that. We talked last week about the fact that we'd like to impart with this group the idea that reparation is needed, and it will happen. The logic will prevail, and it will need to be addressed, and that we should begin to adopt a mindset that even though we can't see what it looks like, how it works, we need to start to think in terms of it is on the horizon. I think that would be helpful. As a church, we're of the thought that we can show leadership in recognizing that to the government. Ultimately, reparation is not something that the private sector can do. We're talking about probably $14 trillion. Talking about Afghan war size money. That's not something that's going to be handled in the private sector. It is going to have to be addressed by the government. That said, how can we as individuals, churches, organizations begin to witness in favor of and in support of reparation, not only from a practical standpoint, as I was talking about with the bubble bursting, but also from a moral standpoint. Go back to the other side of what resonates in Jermaine's discussion. This living within or between a dilemma. You've got the economic dilemma, which is really time horizon oriented, or political horizon that's it's time horizon oriented. Personally, as I began to look more closely at reparation after Jermaine mentioned it to me in a conversation about 5 years ago, and I hadn't really previously considered it. The more I have looked at it, the more I realize that yes, it has to happen, but also that I have to do something. For me, there's the the two sides of things. Instead of, for me, there is the realization that from a practical standpoint, I can't accept that I have benefited from disparities, from favoritism, and I can put dollars to it. I can't accept that. I know I need to do something. I know that also that that for me to ultimately feel right about the relationship with Afro-Americans, I would need to put myself at the same level of risk that Afro-Americans have in terms of economics, and I can't afford, and I'm not strong enough to do that. So for me, I've got this dilemma that I work through, that on the one hand, if I don't do something to address it that's credible to myself, I'm living a falsity, and I cannot do that. On the other hand, I know I can't do everything that I should, but I come out that I can live with my weakness, my inability to do all that I should, much more than I can live with falsity. And falsity being ignoring that things are deeply wrong, and that I have benefited from those wrongs, and those benefits are sitting in investment statements today. So that's the type of thinking that we're hoping will start to resonate with more folk out there, white folk that are in a position to start to support verbally and in what they do, how they invest their dollars, and in what they determine is theirs versus shouldn't be theirs in the first place, and perhaps should be surrendered for benefit of others, in what would be akin to reparation, but it's not reparation is what the government needs to do to get things right. But those of us who have benefited from it, from inequalities, should begin to feel more and more complicit in our benefit, and should recognize that perhaps until the government makes its ultimate move to resolve this matter, we should be doing what we can do to witness for it, and to help fund racial equity programs, to help fund essentially closing the wealth gap, which otherwise is going to expand every year. So that's I'm not sure that that's theological, but I do relate to what Jermaine says about weighing the ultimate, the ideal, which is everything that I might need to do or for the government and for me to promote reparation, even though the horizon is still out there where even on a collective basis, we probably still have some gains that we can see while we don't address this, but the end is coming. But we need to, I have for the last few years been living in that uncomfortable middle place where I'm conflicted, and so that's I guess that's what I would say about relating the theology Jermaine went through to how I see things. I'll stop talking now.
Jim, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. I have a feeling you've inspired us to think with a bigger religious imagination after Jermaine has given us the theological grounding for doing so and setting the terms for what a religious imagination looks like when we're up against the so-called impractical. So I'm really grateful, and I'm just also amazed that we've, in a single conversation, talked about Bruce Springsteen, Barack Obama, John Calvin, Kugo Wano, Maximus Confessor, James Koon, and then some financial data as well about Black wealth. So thank you for this wealth of knowledge.